All right, so tonight I'm gonna make my levain because I wanna mix dough tomorrow morning. So here is my mature starter. I haven't fed it since this morning. It's really bubbly and it smells pretty bad. So I'm gonna take about a tablespoon of that. I've got an empty container here and that's going to be my levain. I like to keep these separate. So I tare my scale and a tablespoon is, let's see how much that weighs. That's about, say 20-ish grams. 22, 23 grams. Doesn't have to be exact. Oh, I'm gonna do a double batch, so I'm gonna do 2 tablespoons. But if you're doing just a single batch, which is 2 loaves of bread, you can just do 1 tablespoon. All right, now I'm gonna add equal parts flour and water. I'm doing a double batch, so I'm gonna do 200 grams of each. If you're doing single, you're gonna do 100 grams of each. Need a little more. Perfect. Mix that up to dissolve your starter in there. Cool. And then I'm going to tare the scale and add my 200 grams of fresh flour, which it's going to start digesting overnight. Right, and so you're gonna mix that up really well until it's incorporated. And again, should have a texture just like your fed starter does because we're doing this at equal parts flour and water. And then I'm just gonna cover it, not airtight. I also don't put my lid on my starter airtight. I literally just put the lid on like that. You wanna have some air able to get in there. So in the morning, you'll know this is ready if you scoop out a little bit of it and plop it in some room temperature water. It should float. If it doesn't float, you could give it a small amount of new water and flour to refresh it a little bit. If it doesn't float and it sinks, it means it's kind of done with all of the available food that's in there. If it floats, it should be able to make your bread rise. All right, and that's it. That's your levain. I'm gonna cover this and go to sleep. Okay, it's Saturday morning and I am ready to mix my bread. So here's the levain that was rising overnight and you can see it's super bubbly and active and it smells delicious. So I'm just gonna do a little float test. Got a little bit of room temp water here. I'm just gonna put some in the water and perfect, it floats. So that means it's ready to make my bread. So I'm going to empty this entire container of levain into this, which is where I mix my bread. And so I tared my scale and I should have about a little more than 400 grams because I'm doing a double batch, but you'll have about 200 if you do a single batch. Great, and just gonna get all of it out here. All right, so all of the levain is in there and now I'm gonna add the water. I'm making a dough, or I'm gonna also put this levain that I did for the float test in there. So I'm making a dough that is 70% white flour and 30% whole wheat. And so I'm gonna hydrate that at 70%. So right now I'm gonna pour 1,400 grams of water over my levain. And again, the optimal temperature for this water is 80 to 85, but I don't take temperature anymore because we like to have this process actually take longer, not faster. So I just used whatever temperature came out of the tap just now. Okay, so that's 1,400. And now you wanna get in there and dissolve the levain a little bit. I'm gonna take it off the scale to do that. Dissolve the levain. Okay, and now we are ready to add the flour. I'm gonna tare that scale again, and I am gonna take my white wheat first. So I'm gonna do 1,400 grams of my white wheat, just plop it in there. So this is just an all-purpose flour. You could use bread flour, but if you want to get really into the nitty-gritty, the protein content of your flour can affect your dough. So just starting with basic all-purpose flour is probably easier, and then you can experiment with some different types of bread flour that have higher protein content. All right, so there we are, that's 1,400 grams. And then the rest of it, I'm using whole wheat flour. So we're gonna get that up to 2,000 grams total flour weight. And that 2,000 grams, the total flour weight, that is my 100%. So everything is weighed against that. So when I say I'm hydrating it at 70%, it's 70% of the flour weight is water. And all of the ingredients are based off of that. So my salt is going to be 2.2%. The levain was just over 20%. It's a nice, easy way to do your ingredients. All right, so we're at total flour weight, 2,000 grams. This is the fun but slightly hard part. I'm going to take it off the scale. And we're going to do the first mix, which is just to hydrate the dough. It's the autolyse phase. I'm going to have a little bowl of water here because starting with a wet hand is going to make it easier. It's going to get all over your hand anyway, but you'll end up using a scraper to take it off. So I've got my plastic scraper here, and I'm going to kind of use my hand like just like a mixer. So I'm just going to start turning it, and I rotate the bowl as I turn. And at first it's gonna seem like it's not gonna come together and maybe it's too dry or you need more water, but just give it time. And then once it's like pretty well incorporated, I'm gonna start squeezing and pinching the dough through my fingers. Because the goal in this part is to really not leave any dry clumps, because we want the water to come into contact with all of the flour. And often I notice that on the bottom is where a lot of the water ends up, so sometimes I scoop that up and get that on the top so I can incorporate that with whatever kind of seems dry. And then also you'll notice it's sticking to the walls of the container a lot. That's only gonna happen right now. As you go farther along, the dough texture is gonna change its quality and it will not be as sticky. But at this point, I'm gonna dip my scraper in some water and I'm just gonna scrape down the edges so that it doesn't stay there and it gets incorporated into the rest of the mixture. And so I'm doing a really large volume here. It won't take you this long if you're doing 2 loaves, but this is probably gonna take me about 5 minutes. So you'll know it's done when you don't see or really feel any more globs of dry flour. And I'm like just kind of like making a fist and cutting the dough right now. All right, so I'm gonna keep at this. All right, I just finished that mixing. That was about 5 minutes, and I used my scraper to scrape down the edges. You can see the texture of the dough has already changed. It's so much smoother, and it's not as sticky and clumpy. And then you just want to use this to scrape off your hands so that all of that dough goes into the mix. Okay, so it's been about a half hour. And I'm ready to do the final mix, which is the stage that you incorporate the salt. I'm gonna take my ring off. So here I have salt that is 2.2% of the weight of my flour. So for me, that's 44 grams. If you're doing a single batch, it's gonna be 22 grams. I'm gonna sprinkle that all over the top of the dough. And I am gonna add a little more water as well to help incorporate that salt. So I'm just gonna pour some of my leftover water that I had when I mixed earlier. I'm gonna add about 50 more grams. So that's gonna bring my water percentage up to about 72.5. All right, so I'm gonna pour that over the surface as well. Now this is one of the more difficult stages, I use this technique that I learned in the Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast book called the pincer method. And you're basically going to use your thumb and index finger to cut the dough. And at first it's going to separate and come apart from each other. And it's going to seem like it's not doing the right thing, but it will start to build strength and come together. So you're going to combine the pincer method with folding the dough over itself. And you're going to do that until you don't feel any more granules of salt. So the first thing, and I kind of like doing it initially with my scraper. First thing I'm going to do is a fold. I'm going to like just fold the dough over itself to encapsulate the salt on the inside. And then I'm going to take my hand and like a claw, literally cut the dough. And it's going to break off from the rest of it. And so you'll have like these small clumps. But the more you do this, it's going to start actually adhering to itself. So I just did that, and now I'm going to fold it again. And I always rotate my bang while I'm doing this. So I'm going to fold it, and now I'm going to cut again. And you want to go all the way until you feel that the dough breaks against your cutting action. Okay, and now I'm going to fold again, and it's still not quite holding together, but it's going to start rapidly changing texture. So just keep alternating that until you have fully incorporated the extra water and all the granules of salt. I can still feel the salt at this stage. So this can also take about 5 minutes. A little bit faster if you're not doing this much volume. And then at some point, I usually just continue to do this pincer, and I'm going from the underside and rotating. And now you can see it's starting to stick to itself a little bit more. It's not really breaking up as much, even though I'm still doing the pincer. You see how it's pulling away from the side of the container also. So the gluten is building strength, and you can see the strands developing. And I'm starting to feel less salt granules. There's still a little bit, but it's definitely getting smoother. And I might do a couple of these folds now again. Just pick it up and fold it over itself from the bottom over to the top. And maybe one more round of the pincer. Yeah, it's definitely getting much smoother, as you can see, and it's much stronger. I can pull on it and it's not breaking. So this is probably a good point to stop. I don't feel any more salt, and the texture has completely changed. I don't see any more water hanging around. That's all been absorbed. And now I'm just gonna clean off my hand, get any dough back into the container. And I'm just gonna dip this in my water bucket and scrape down the sides again, just because that'll be harder to clean off later, so you might as well help yourself now. All right, and so now we've finished the mixing phase completely, and we're entering what's called the bulk fermentation. So this is the period where the dough is going to rise. And during this period, we let the dough rest right now for about 20 minutes, and then we're gonna give it a fold. And that is gonna continue to help building gluten. And I'm gonna do that 2 or 3 times depending on how the dough feels. Each fold makes the dough stronger, and so you'll start to learn as you're doing bread more, just based on feel, if the dough needs a 3rd fold or if it even needs a 4th fold. We keep the kitchen pretty cool, and I didn't use very warm water, so it's probably not going to ferment too fast. I can probably get away with just 2 or 3 folds. But I'm going to put the lid on, keep it airtight, and give it that first fold in 20 minutes. Okay, so the dough has been resting and I'm ready to do my first fold. The first one I'm gonna do is the normal fold that you would learn in the book. And I'm just gonna, again, dip my hands in water. It's just easier to hold the dough when your hands are wet. So I'm actually standing up and bending over to do this. I'm stabilizing this with my feet just because it's easier. You're gonna reach underneath and grab like half the dough, lift it, and then let it drop over itself. And then do a quarter turn on the bucket. Do the same thing. Gather the dough from underneath itself, stretch it up, drop it over. Same thing, quarter turn. We're gonna lift it, drop it over itself. And last one, do a little more water on my hands. Reach under, lift, grab, and that's it. So that's called one fold. And now we're gonna let the dough rest again and do this again in about 20-25 minutes. So I'm probably gonna do at least 3 folds on this dough. I want it nice and strong to handle all the fermentation that's gonna happen. Okay, I'm gonna show you another technique for folding the dough that I like even better than the regular one I just showed you. This is called the slap and fold, and I'm gonna actually make the surface of my counter a little bit wet, and I'm going to pour out the dough onto my countertop. So I'm using a silicone, like rounded edge scraper to help get it out. And at this point, your container's empty. You did want to put a little bit, like a spray of neutral oil. It will make getting the dough out easier if you do the slap and fold technique that I'm about to show you. I don't have any more right now, so I'm not gonna do it. All right, so slap and fold is pretty simple. I'm gonna take my hand in the bucket of water, wet them a little bit. I'm gonna use my flat scraper, reach underneath the dough, pull it over itself, and fold it, just like we did in the bucket. I'm gonna do that in all 4 directions. Okay, and now I'm gonna pick it up from underneath here, slap it on the counter, and fold it over itself, and pull it toward me. Rotate it, slap it, fold it over, pull it toward me. Slap, fold, pull, slap, fold, pull. And it's already getting more strength. It's holding its shape, right? And you want to be gentle. If it gets to the point where the skin starts to break like it is here, stop. That means you're taxing the gluten more than it can handle. So I just kind of rotated it into a ball just a little bit so that it's easier to transfer. I'm going to slide this underneath, pick it up, and plop it back in. And I'm going to let that rest. I'm probably going to let that go maybe 25, even 30 minutes, because the slap and fold builds a little more strength than the regular folding that I showed you in the bucket. And so I want to let the glutens relax a little bit longer before I do that again. All right, so my dough has finished bulking. I may have let it go a little long because it's kind of huge, but it's gonna be great. So we're going to dump this out onto the countertop. I'm gonna tilt it and then use my spatula, or my silicone scraper rather, to just help ease it out onto the countertop. We actually don't usually use flour on the countertop, so you'll get used to working with the dough. And I've actually found that water works better than flour anyway. Just a little bit of water on your hands can help prevent the dough from sticking to you. So I'm gonna get every little bit out of the container. I'm gonna switch to my sharper scraper to really get it out. All right, so you could weigh the dough, but I don't really feel like trying to get those pieces on a scale, so I'm just gonna eyeball it. So I'm gonna cut this in half, just kind of separate it from itself. And then in half again for each piece. And I should have 4 breads. So we are going to do what's called a pre-shape, where you do loose shaping of the dough and then we're gonna let it rest, do the bench rest for at least 10 minutes. So I'm gonna flip my dough over and I'm gonna use this to help me pick it up, and we're gonna basically do a fold in all directions. Whoa, almost dropped my camera. All right, take 2. Fold in all directions, whoops. All right, and then I'm just gonna take it and use my hands to pull the seam against the countertop and create some tension. And I kind of rotate and pull, rotate, pull, rotate, pull. And once it's in a nice little circular shape, we'll leave that and do the next one. So you're kind of just like creating a little package, folding it over itself, and then pull the seam under and then rotate. And you'll feel it. It creates surface tension by dragging it on the counter. You don't need to go too hard because you don't want it to rip. You want to keep the gluten intact. I'm going to flip this one over because the soft side was clearly on top, or the top of the dough. And so it's a little bit sticky, but it's not so much that I can't work with it. All right, so we're going to let those rest. I'm going to cover each of them with a towel. If you don't do that, the air is going to dry out the surface of the dough and they'll develop a skin, and you don't want to lose the moisture. So they're all going to get a little clean towel, and we'll come back in 15 minutes and do the final shape. All right, my doughs have rested for about 15 minutes, and I have my baskets that they're gonna do their final proof in. I'm gonna put a little bit of rice flour in them to make sure the dough doesn't stick, although these ones with the cloth, they don't really tend to stick, so I don't need to do a lot. So I'm gonna uncover all of my doughs. And you want to invert the dough before you shape it again. So just need to get a new bench knife. So I'm gonna start with this one over here. So I'm gonna slide the bench knife underneath and flip it over onto its back. And then you're just going to take the ends of it and kind of stretch it a little bit, and then fold it about halfway over itself. And then take one side and do the same thing. Fold it over, take the other, fold it over, and then take the final side, stretch it, fold it over itself, and then do that again so the seam is on the table, and then start doing your circle again. So just gently turning it and pulling it toward you, turning it and pulling it toward you, so that you create surface tension again in the dough. And then I'm gonna let it sit on its seam, which we've created under there, for a minute or so before popping it into a basket. So same thing, flip onto its back, and let's do the other way. I think this is easier. Take the piece far away from you, turn it over itself, and then one side, and then the other, and then the one closest to you, turn it over, and then roll it and start your circles. Okay. So that seems good. Again, you don't want to break the surface of the dough. Last one. Okay, so I'm gonna start with the one I did first and grab my baskets. That one's a little bit smaller. I already put some rice flour into this. I'm gonna take my bench scraper again, do a quick slide under and have my hand ready to take the smooth surface, and we're gonna put it seam side up into the basket. Okay, we're gonna do that with all of them. This one looks kind of big and this basket is pretty big, so I'm gonna take that one, put it here. And then I have two, we call these batard shaped baskets. I didn't shape this into a batard, but it will take on the shape of that basket as it's resting. All right, and then if you want, you can kind of pinch the seam together. Okay, so that is our final shape. I'm gonna cover these. You really don't want any air getting in. So we use a clean kitchen towel, rubber band, and then we do that whole thing in a plastic bag. And then these are gonna go in the fridge for about 12, 14 hours until we bake them in the morning. So I'll see you then. Okay, we just pulled these out of the fridge. This is the next batch to go in. So we're going to take off our bags and the towels. So these have proofed up nicely. And if you give them a little finger dent test, the dough should not spring up. I should have put flour on my hand, but the dough should not spring up right back at you right away. It should retain a little bit of whatever indent you just gave it. Looks pretty good. If it does spring up right away, then you could let it go a little bit longer. Yeah, see, there's a little bit of indent left. All right, so we're gonna bring them over to our floured cutting board. This is why the tripod's better. And we are going to score the loaf. So the Dutch ovens have been preheating in the oven at 490. You could do 490, 500 degrees. Takes a little bit to get to know your oven. And I recommend having an actual thermometer in there to see if what the temperature reading says on the outside is actually what's going on the inside. So he's just getting rid of some of the flour from the previous loaves bake because we don't want that to burn. So the first step is turning out, the loaves onto the floured surface. You use rice flour for this because it doesn't stick to the loaf as much as regular flour will. And he's going to dump it out. And he's going to wipe off some of the excess flour from the surface using our lame. That's the razor blade that we're going to score the loaf with. And scoring is important because when you make that slash, it allows the full rise of the bread to happen. So he's putting it in the Dutch oven and then he's gonna slice it down the middle. Looks beautiful. You can already see some holes and some air pockets in there. And he's gonna put the lid on it and you bake the first 25 minutes in the oven with the lid on. And we're gonna drop the temp from its preheating temperature down to 475. And I'm gonna set my timer for 25 minutes. Well, I'll do that after so you don't hear those annoying beeps. And bread number 2. So this is a different type of Dutch oven. The previous one is a combo cooker. It's a little easier to load the bread in. You have to be really careful when doing this part because the walls are pretty deep and you have to be careful not to burn yourself. So I recommend the combo cooker. Great, lid on. And that one's going in, 25 minutes. We'll check back in on these in a little bit. So it's been 25 minutes and now it's time to take off the lids.
Wow, nice.
This happens every time.
Oh yeah, beautiful.
Looking good. Take a peek. Ooh, looks pretty good. It's got some hot spots on it, but that's because the oven's small and there's not a lot of space. All right, they are both out of the oven and they are gonna cool on this rack. You need to let them cool for at least an hour, if not more, before cutting into them because the baking process is actually not done. They are going to continue to bake on the insides, and if you cut into them too early, the inside is going to be gummy and not yet ready structure-wise to support even some butter or whatever you want to put on the bread. And the crust is still forming right now too, so gotta wait at least an hour, but ideally 2. And that's it. You have delicious homemade bread.